So we're starting Shakespeare. We're done with Sophocles and the Oedipus plays. Might make some references to them as we go through these two works of Shakespeare. Make sure you read those pages carefully in the 11th edition. They give background information to Shakespeare's theater, not the Globe, theater in Shakespeare's day, how it arose, when it arose, etc. Key terms, soliloquy, aside, things like that, discussion of comedy. Before we talk about Shakespeare himself, let me just briefly, there's three major stages, or periods if you want, of drama in world literature. Classical period, ancient Greece and Rome, from the beginnings, 5th, 6th century BC Greece, to the end of the real Roman Empire, not the later made up ones. 4th century, very early 5th century, sacking of Rome in 410 AD, pretty much ends drama. Okay? Drama at that point is dead for several hundred years. It doesn't revive until the later Middle Ages, late 13th, early 14th centuries, can't really put an exact date on it, when in the Easter liturgy in the Catholic Church in England, you get this trope, this figure, called the Quem Quaertus. It's Quem Quaertis. That's Latin for whom do you seek? And it's this little 4-line part in the Easter liturgy when two people inside a church are given the task of reading these 4 lines from Scripture. Okay? And the 4 lines of Scripture are from 2 different speakers in the Gospel accounts. In the part of the story that the 4 lines are about are when the women run to the tomb of Christ on very early sunrise that Sunday morning. And they go and they see the stone rolled away and the tomb is empty. And a man there, seemingly a man, says, "Whom do you seek?" And they say, "We seek the Lord." "Do you know where he is?" "Whom do you seek?" "We seek the Lord." "Do you know where he is?" 3 lines. "He's not here. He's been raised from the dead. He's gone forth to Galilee. Go find him there." I believe it's from the book of Mark, Gospel of Mark. Okay? That's read in the earliest form antiphonally. That is, you have people on one side of the church, choir usually, one side of the church, or chancel, and a choir on the other side. And they will sing hymns, for example, psalms, where this side will read or sing one verse, and this side will sing the other verse, and they respond. Well, they do that with this passage. That develops into people then acting out these lines. So somebody from over here, somebody from over here, they move towards each other and play it. Okay? English drama starts there. Again, late 1200s, early 1300s, probably. All right? And it develops and grows. And your introduction talks about the 3 main kind of groups of English plays: mystery plays, miracle plays, morality plays, the kinds of subjects each one of those deals with, because they're not the same. Make sure you're familiar with that. And then we get up to the Shakespearean period. All right? Renaissance, if you want. 16th century, roughly 1500 to 1642, we could say, because 1642 is when all the playhouses are shut down for good. Couple of reasons: plague, okay, but also because playwrights are knocking the king and the king doesn't like it, and they're on knocking Puritans and the Puritans don't like it, so just shut it down. Plays are revived in 1660, and you get some more plays, 1660 to the early 18th century, etc. But the next big major period is the modern period, 19th century up to today. Okay? So 3 major periods: Greek and Roman, 16th to the mid 17th century, and modern 19th century to today. Okay? Shakespeare, to get to Shakespeare, Shakespeare is born on or about, on or about April 23rd, 1564. Why do I say or about? We don't have his birth certificate. We do have tons of birth certificates for people from that period. We just don't have his. Okay? And there are other writers that we don't have the actual birth certificate. Okay? We do have a baptismal certificate. And with knowing how baptisms were performed in Shakespeare's day, most scholars assume that it's safe to say April 23rd is his birth date. Right? I think they also do that partially because he dies on April 23rd, 52 years later. So I'm 9 years older than Shakespeare was when he died. I don't want to compare what he did with his life with what I did with my life, because it doesn't compare. Though my kids were all alive and all of his kids. Shakespeare has no heirs. No living heirs today. His entire line dies out by 1700. It's kind of interesting. A lot of major writers, their lines totally die out. Shakespeare, John Donne, we're going to talk about, John Milton, none of them have living heirs. It's like all of their power doesn't go into their genes, it goes into their writings, and then they, whatever. So, born April 23rd, 1564, dies April 23rd, 1616. It's kind of interesting, or fortuitous, or providential, whatever you want to call it, because this day, April 23rd, forgot to tell my first class, is St. George's Day. St. George is the patron saint of England. The guy who supposedly, church tradition, killed a dragon. Okay? Which is why you'll see a dragon on a lot of, English insignia and such. And St. George is usually dressed in white with a red cross on his uniform, on his shield. It's called the Red Cross Knight. So, patron writer of England, born on the patron saint's day, it's just, has nice symmetry to it. Okay? His father is, a fairly important person in Stratford. He rises to become mayor. It's during his tenure as mayor that Parliament issues a law that says all the religious iconography in churches, wall paintings, frescoes and such, has got to be painted over. Why? Because the Parliament in England are becoming more and more Protestant. Religious iconography was thought to be, well, that's just Catholic. We're not Catholic anymore because of Henry VIII and that kind of stuff. So he is responsible, his father is, for painting over the religious imagery on the inside of what's called the Guildhall Church in Stratford. You can go to that church today, you can go inside, and you can see the whitewashing on the walls. He didn't cover it very well. In other words, he followed the letter of the law, he put whitewashing on, but you can still see the images through. It's also, today, much of that whitewashing has been removed. I mean, really removed, so that you can see the imagery, okay? It's thought by some that the reason he did such a poor job of the whitewashing is because his family was Catholic. They descended from Catholics, okay? And this is during the Catholic Protestant difficulty, let's call it, troubles in England, okay? Shakespeare gets married late 1582, November to December. He's 18 and a half, and he marries Anne Hathaway, who also comes from an old family in Warwickshire. They're both from Stratford-upon-Avon, which is the town of Stratford that the Avon River runs through. That's why it's called Stratford-upon-Avon. Her mother's name is Mary Arden. Okay, you can go to her house today. And there's a forest outside Stratford called the Arden Forest. It's named for the family. So they were somewhat well off. When he marries Anne Hathaway, she's 26. To be 26 and unmarried and a woman in Shakespeare's day, total double standard, right? Because this doesn't apply to men. To be a 26-year-old unmarried woman in Shakespeare's day means, to use a very old-fashioned term, you are an old spinster. You are almost unmarriable by that point. Well, there's a reason they get married in November or December. And one other comment before I get to the birth of their daughter. Shakespeare applies for and receives a wedding license. He doesn't do that in Warwickshire, in the town of his birth and where he lives. It's in the county of Warwickshire, okay? I believe it's an adjoining county. You were not required to get a wedding license in Shakespeare's day. If you want to get married in the United States, you have to get a wedding license. I can't remember which state. A couple of states have really weird laws about that. Anyways, you don't have to have it unless one thing requires it. And the thing that requires it is if the banns are not read for your upcoming wedding. The banns, it's an actual phrase, it's an actual statement that a priest or rector or pastor of a church has to announce publicly on each of 3 successive Sundays prior to the Sunday that you're going to get married. And the banns are, and it's exact same language that you'll sometimes hear in a Protestant wedding ceremony today. William Shakespeare and Hathaway are to be wed on date X. If there's anyone who knows any reason why they should not get married, let him speak now. In the modern Protestant ceremony, it's, or forever hold his peace. Well, a reason may be, she's not a virgin because I slept with her last week. That's cause enough to call it off. Notice, it's not for a woman to stand up and say, well, he's not a virgin because I slept with him last night. Doesn't count. Double standard, right? Apparently, the banns was read once. Then Shakespeare got the wedding license. They never went ahead with the other banns. This is like late November, 1582. 6 months later, I think it's May 26th or May 27th, 1583, their first child was born, Susanna. And it is, if I remember right, it's just about 6 months, right? December, January, February, March, April. Yep, 6 months. Little bit early, shotgun wedding. Year and a half later, February 2nd, 1585, they have twins, Hamnet and Judith. I believe Hamnet is the eldest, not Hamlet, Hamnet. He dies 11 years later. All right. Susanna gets married. She marries a doctor. You can go to their house today. There's a whole bunch of Shakespeare properties in Stratford. It's fun to spend a day in Stratford. Okay. Drawing a total blank about Judith. Okay. And Shakespeare dies 1616, as I said, on his birthday, and Hathaway dies 1623. She is 67, I think, upon her death, something like that. Okay? Then, from February of 1585 to late 1592, trying to remember if there's an exact date. I don't think I've got it pulled up here. No, I don't have the exact date. To late 1592, you have what are called the lost years or the dark years. Okay? And all that's meant by that is we have no idea where Shakespeare was or what he was doing. There are no records at all of him. From the birth certificate of his children in February 1585 to, in 1592, a publication attributed to this guy, Robert Greene. It's attributed to him on the page, but there are some scholars who think it wasn't him. They think it's these other two writers possibly, both of whom publicly denied that they wrote it. All right? He was dead, I think, when it was finally published. And that publication, it's a pamphlet, essentially, is titled A Groat's Worth, Groats, then the word worth, of wit, and I forgot the bought with 1,000,000 of repentance. It's his kind of deathbed repentance statement. I'm going to die, and here I want to repent for my licentious, wild living, and I want to let go of everything that's on my chest. Okay? A lot of what it is a warning to other writers, okay, about these new, upcoming writers in London. And the other writers he's talking about are playwrights. It's kind of addressed to, for example, Christopher Marlowe, who dies the very next year, 1593. Marlowe and I can't remember the other writer. That he specifically is kind of warning. Beware of these new writers. And he singles out one that he refers to, and in the actual publication, this phrase is in a different font style. So it's kind of meant to sit out and jump out at you. Where he says, beware of this tiger's heart wrapped in a player's hide. A Johannes Factotum, that is a Johnny Do-It-All, jack of all trades, all right, who imagines himself, hold on, this part I do have, an upstart crow beautified with our feathers, that with his tiger's heart wrapped in a player's hide, supposes he is as well able to bombast out a blank verse as the best of you, and being an absolute Johannes Factotum, and is in his own conceit the only shake scene in a country. Okay? This phrase, tiger's heart wrapped in a player's hide, comes from Shakespeare's Henry VI, Part 3, or 3 Henry VI. It's an exact quote, except for one word. Shakespeare's play reads, a tiger's heart wrapped in a woman's hide. Meaning, a woman who has a kind of a ferocious spirit. Green's text replaces that to a player who has kind of a ferocious spirit. In other words, not somebody you can trust. All right? And then a jack of all trades, the Johannes Factotum, implying this is somebody who thinks he can do everything. All right? Who, how's he put it? Is in his own conceit the only shake scene in a country. The fact that you have this and then the shake scene, a pun on Shakespeare, makes every scholar believe he's referring to Shakespeare. All right? I think this is published in September 1592. So this tells us a couple things. One, this play has already been written. Henry VI, Part 3, has already been written. It's probably already been produced. It's already been played. How else could he know about it? Unless he got an illegal copy of the play. I don't mean illegal as in violated copyright. There was no copyright at this time. There was no idea of plagiarism at this time. It didn't exist. Okay? Illegal in the sense of having stolen a copybook. That is, if you're part of an acting company, you each get your own copy of the play that emphasizes your lines. It will have your cue, somebody else's line that gives you when to come out. Okay? So it tells us Shakespeare's already published, he's already in London, and he's making a name for himself. Because this guy, Robert Greene, he's literally on his deathbed. He's what's called a university wit. He had attended university, and he makes his living by writing. That's a new thing at this point. Nobody, until really the 1580s at the earliest, nobody made their living just by writing. They did other things, and writing was the hobby you did in your meantime, right? And he was well known. Nobody reads his stuff today. It's boring. It's just garbage. It's the kind of stuff you pick up in a checkout stand at a grocery store, right? So, if Shakespeare's already written this by 1592, when did he write it? We don't know. But we do know, because something that is mentioned right after this, not in Groats Worth of Wit, but in another author. He's already written Comedy of Errors, and he's probably already written Titus Andronicus. So what was he doing during these 7 years? No conclusive proof. There are a lot of theories. One theory is, and some of these go back to the very early 18th century, like 1705. One theory is that he was a headmaster of a school, teacher. Okay? No evidence. We don't see him on a list of rolls anywhere as a teacher. Another theory is that he was part of a traveling actors company, because there were provincial companies that went throughout England and such. No evidence of that. Another one is that he traveled on the continent. He went to Italy, he went to Spain, he went to France, he went to Germany, did things like that. Another one is that he acted as a secretary for a powerful person who went to the continent. And so he was traveling with this person, writing letters, blah, blah, blah. Okay? One of the advantages of that theory, of the theory that he'd gone to the continent, is he would pick up foreign languages there, like Italian, possibly Spanish, definitely French. Why is that important? Because we know some of Shakespeare's sources are only available in foreign languages. A source for Midsummer Night's Dream is only available in French. So, Shakespeare wrote it, he had to know some French, all right? There's one other one. Can't remember what it is. So, we know, 1592, he's in London. He only goes back to Stratford a few times over the next 20 years. One of those, I believe, is when he's applied for a coat of arms for his father. And he wants to do that so that his father can be called a gentleman. It's a rise in social status, all right? Even though he's been mayor. By the way, when he was mayor, he kind of left under a cloud and lost. He didn't just lose the mayorship. He lost social standing. A lot of debt, things like that. Shakespeare had to bail him out. Shakespeare was a good businessman. We'll talk about that when we get to some of this stuff. And then later on, he buys a piece of property called New Place. It's still called that. There's no house left there. But it was like the biggest house in Stratford at the time. So Shakespeare had money. He also bought property in London. Again, he was not just, the starving artist writing away in the rotted garret and such. Okay? So, let's say he begins writing in 1590. No reason to assume it's not earlier, but it's a round number. He stops in 1612. He moves back to Stratford, 1612, 1613, and then dies, 3 years later. During that period, he writes 4 long poems, by long, several hundred lines. I think the shortest of the long poems is about 300. I think the longest is something like 700. Not sure about that. 154 sonnets. Sonnets are 14-line poems. That's over 1,500 lines right there. And then 37 full-length 5-act plays. I think the shortest of Shakespeare's plays, if you were to produce it without any cuts, it's like 2.5, 3 hours. The longest, Hamlet, Lear, 4 hours minimum. I don't think there's a single version of Hamlet available that you can watch that hasn't had something cut. Even Kenneth Branagh's version is 4 hours. And I think it cuts some, okay? Long plays. Leave all that out. Just the 37 plays in 22 years. That's 1.5 of these plays every year. People think Stephen King, used to churn out a lot. These are bear in mind, Shakespearean. And I don't mean just, written by Shakespeare. I mean Shakespearean in quality. Not one of Shakespeare's plays is a quote-unquote bad play. Even the worst of Shakespeare's plays, which some people would say would be something like Titus Andronicus, as an example. And that's just because it's full of blood and gore. Is better than the best of most of his contemporaries, with the exception of Christopher Marlowe. But Marlowe dies very young. Young during Shakespeare's lifetime. Marlowe dies in 1593. Okay? Most of his plays are written late 1580s until then. That's an amazing turnout, or amazing output, let's say. All right? From 1592 until, that should be 1603 or 1602, Shakespeare is a member of what's called the Lord Chamberlain's Men. That's the name of his acting company. They're called the Lord Chamberlain's Men because they are patronized. They're supported by the Lord Chamberlain. The Lord Chamberlain is pretty much the second most powerful person in England, behind the Queen. So you have this guy kind of standing behind you, fronting you, so that if somebody else attacks the play group, the acting group, they have him to appeal to. It kind of gives them some protection. It probably, not saying it did, okay? Probably. It probably gave Shakespeare some protection in terms of what he could write and say. The only reason I say that is because Queen Elizabeth had people executed for saying things against her. She had people's, literally, their tongues cut out for saying things that she didn't like. She had writers' hands cut off to stop them from writing ever again. Right? In 1603, they become the King's Men. Why? Queen Elizabeth dies. Her cousin, James VI of Scotland, becomes James I of England. He becomes their patron. All right? Let me back up for just a moment. Theaters, buildings. In 1576, a guy named James Burbage, he has a partner whose name I'm forgetting, erects a building in Shoreditch, which is an area north and east of what today is called the City Mile, which is like a square mile, which is the city of London itself. If you go to London and you're walking down, for example, the Strand, and you're going towards the City Mile, you're going to come to a point where there's going to be, in the middle of the street, a dragon. It's a statue of a dragon facing outward. When you hit that dragon, that means you are now in the old city of London. And you keep walking, and you're going to, about a mile later, you're going to come to another dragon, facing the other direction. Okay? These dragons are on all the major thoroughfares around the city of London. They're protection, so to speak. This is in Shoreditch, where he raises this theater. If I remember correctly, it's just outside that boundary. The land that Burbage builds the theater on is leased. He doesn't own the land. He owns the building because he's paid for that. In 1599, the lease comes due on that land. So he has one of two options. Buy the land, okay, or the building, the theater, becomes the landowner's property. Well, he doesn't want to buy the land. So the Lord Chamberlain's men, a member of whom is Richard Burbage, James Burbage's son, called the greatest actor of the age. Shakespeare wrote specific characters for him to play. The Chamberlain's men hire some men and they take apart the theater. They transport it south across the River Thames into the area called Southwark, if you want. And they rebuild it and they rename it. They name it the Globe. Why? It's shaped as a circle. You can go today to what's called Shakespeare's Globe on Bankside, that's the south bank of the River Thames, and you can see the globe, you can go to see plays, etc. From the outside, it looks totally identical to the original. It is almost totally identical even on the inside, with a couple of changes. I was there in 1595 when they were finishing the building of it. They built it exactly the way the original one was. English timbers, okay? No nails, no fasteners. It's all mortise and tenon and pegs kind of stuff. It's made out of the same kind of lime, casting, everything, right? Two changes. The seats, the benches, are built to accommodate our size that they would not accommodate in Shakespeare's day. Why? They were smaller. I think the average height of an Elizabethan male was something like 5'4", 5'5". So Tom Cruise would have just loved to be alive then, because I think Tom Cruise is 5'5". All right? And they were not as wide as we are today. Shakespeare's Globe today, I think it has a total capacity of 3,000. I think the seating in his day held close to that. The other change is the ceiling, the roof. Sorry, not ceiling. Shakespeare's day, it was all thatched. 1612, production of Henry VIII. Have to fire a cannon. I think it's from the stage. So they roll out a cannon, they fire a blank, but the wadding in the muzzle comes out, lands on the thatched roof, and the globe burns to the ground. It's never rebuilt until beginning 1993, 1994. An American filmmaker wants to rebuild the globe. You know, the Brits still just, it drives them crazy that an American came up with this idea. Okay? Rebuilds the globe. You can go to the globe today. You can see productions done the exact same way. They would have been done in Shakespeare's day, some of them with Elizabethan dress and Elizabethan pronunciation. All right? But no sound amplification. I've been to the Globe over 20 times. They never use mics. And that's, the stage, well, here's a drawing. You've got a picture in your book. Stage is about 42 feet wide, 24 feet deep. Back of the stage, you have what's called the tiring house, where they change and where they enter and exit from the stage. It's got two big columns that hold up a partial roof over the stage. This is the seating area, the gallery, 3 levels, right? And this is what's called the yard. This is where the groundlings stood. You paid a penny to get admittance here. Today it's £5. I think it might have been I think it's £7 now. And you stand. And you have to stand today throughout the entire play. If you sit down, one of the docents, one of the volunteers who works there will come up and say, please stand. If it starts pouring down rain and you pop up an umbrella, they'll take it from you. They'll give you a little plastic thing to put over yourself, but you take this and you take what happens. One big difference between today and Shakespeare's day, though. This wasn't paved. It was just sawdust and dirt and stuff. And whatever else is on the ground. What do I mean? People would come in, they'd bring snack lunch and such, they'd bring food. If it was rotted, they'd drop it and throw it on the ground. And we have written anecdotes, written accounts that talk about men dropping their breeches and relieving themselves, 1 and 2, during plays. Okay? Why is this significant? If they didn't like the production, if the groundlings didn't like the play, bend down, scoop up what's on the ground, and throw it at the actors. Okay? Which, kind of gives a good incentive for the actors to do their best. And for the playwrights they hire, or for the playwrights who write for them, to also write good plays. So 2 things going on here that I didn't mention in my first class. The people who are sitting here in the galleries, they can afford the nice seats. This is the middle and upper class. This is not the poor, but these are the blue-collar workers, if you want to use a modern phrase. These are construction workers. These are people who work with their hands all day long. They can only afford a penny, essentially. So as an author, you've got to appeal to what? The educated and the uneducated. So you have to have elements in the plays that satisfy differing sensibilities, all right? Okay. Shakespeare dies 1616. I've got everything else covered. Yeah. Shakespeare dies 1616. What's called the First Folio is published in 1623. The First Folio is the first collected edition of Shakespeare's plays. It has almost all of them. It doesn't have all of them. All right? 7 years from when he dies to this. Now, individual copies of many of Shakespeare's plays were printed during his lifetime. We don't know if Shakespeare was behind those printings. Some of those plays, copies of those plays, for example, for both Hamlet and Lear, are very different than the versions that show up in the First Folio. There are entire speeches left out or added. That is, one version has a speech, the other version doesn't. One version doesn't have a speech, the other version does, kind of thing. This discrepancy in time between when Shakespeare dies and when the First Folio is published, and by the way, it's published by members of his acting troupe, okay, and friends of his. And they say, we went around and we collected these things and we da-da-da. And it has prefatory material, a couple of poems by Ben Jonson that we're going to read later, okay, that introduce it. And get into what's called the authorship question. And the authorship question is essentially this. Well, let me rephrase that. The authorship question is an assertion proposed by people that the William Shakespeare who was born and died at Stratford-upon-Avon was not the person who wrote the plays attributed to him. They say that for a couple of reasons. One, as far as we know, that William Shakespeare never attended university. What that really means is only a university-educated person could have written these plays. That is a very elitist idea. Okay? Two, only someone essentially who was born and raised in London could have written these plays. Not because the plays reference London and such, but because London's the cultural capital of England. To have somebody like Shakespeare from Stratford-on-Avon, roughly 80, 90 miles away from London, to write the greatest plays in the English language, okay, would be like saying the greatest writer in the American English language is from Woodbury, or Laverne, or Lewisburg, or pick your, not slamming anybody's hometown, pick your podunk town compared to LA, New York, or Washington, D.C. All right? The problem is there's no proof for any of these writers, scholars, assertions that Shakespeare wasn't Shakespeare. That is, there's nobody in Shakespeare's day, let me put it this way, suggested that the Shakespeare from Stratford wasn't the author of the poems. Nobody. Or the plays. Nobody else took credit for the plays. All right? There is evidence within the plays, dialectal kind of stuff, word usage kind of stuff, that indicates someone from from Warwickshire, was involved. Shakespeare was from Stratford-on-Avon, which is in the middle of the county of Warwickshire. Okay? Often, people who suggest that Shakespeare wasn't Shakespeare, not all of them, but some of them have ulterior motives. The first person who raised the question was someone, if I remember correctly, was someone who was a descendant of Francis Bacon. He asserted that Francis Bacon was the author of the plays. So you have Francis Bacon, you have a guy named Edward de Vere, an Earl of Oxford. The proponents of the de Vere authorship are the heirs, descendants of Edward de Vere, etc. One of the actors, I just praise up one side and down the other, a guy named Mark Rylance. He's been in a few films. He was the first artistic director of Shakespeare's Globe from 1997 to 2007. Saw several plays with him. Fantastic director, even better actor. I mean, he is one of the greatest actors alive. He wrote a book called Play, which is about the first 10 years of Shakespeare's Globe, the reconstructed Globe. And he says in the opening statements something to the effect of the Shakespeare from Stratford is not the person who wrote these plays. And he says it because essentially a country yokel could not have written these plays. One comment about that. It's assumed Shakespeare never went to university, the Shakespeare of Stratford. Why? We don't have a record of him at any university. Okay? University rolls aren't entirely accurate. We don't have an actual record of John Donne having attended any university. It's assumed he did. Why? Because he knew Greek, he knew Latin, he knew French. He wrote in Greek. He writes a treatise supporting suicide in Greek after he's a priest. Okay, it's supposed to be a big no-no. So that's not proof of anything. Two, it's thought Shakespeare attended the local grammar school in Stratford, named the King Edward VI School. Okay? There's no record. He's not on the list of rolls. Not They don't have a complete list of roles for all the years that Shakespeare, would have been a child there. If he had attended that school, he would have attended from about the age 6 to about the age 12. He would have learned Latin and Greek during that 6-year period. In fact, by the time he got to the last 3 years, most of the instruction would have been conducted, would have been taught in only Latin and Greek. His teachers would not be speaking English to him. They'd only be speaking Latin and Greek. It's been said by some that a grammar school education in Shakespeare's day would give one an equivalent amount of knowledge in Latin and Greek as a modern 20th century, 21st century college degree in classics. College degree, 4 years, Latin and Greek. You could go to Swanee and get a classics degree. Shakespeare would have had by the age of 12 the same amount of knowledge of Latin and Greek. All right? Which is important because some of his sources were only available at that time in Latin and Greek. Okay? Now, I mentioned, what was he doing? We don't know what he was doing during that period. But if he did travel the continent, and assuming that this Shakespeare is the same writer and everything, he had a wonderful facility for language. And we know that, one way we know that, Shakespeare created over 1,600 of the words he uses. That is, his is the first recorded use of them. That's like, if I remember, that's like 15 to 20%. No, take that back. I think it's like 12 to 15% of the known English vocabulary of his day. We have over 2 million words in the English language today. That'd be like one of us creating 15% of those words. It's like what, 150, 300,000? We don't even use that many words. The average American uses, in their traditional vocabulary, 50 to 75,000 words. I mean, what this author did in creating these words is just stupefying. So he had an ability with language. Obviously, I think it's bunch bunk. What else? Did all that. George's Day. Okay. 8 minutes. Look at A Midsummer Night's Dream on 1181, 1182. We're not going to get very far, maybe 20 lines into it at all. Basic story. Oh, one other thing. I forgot about that. Remember I had written up here a couple weeks ago the 3 unities? Aristotle, unity of place, unity of time, unity of action. It occurs on one setting, it occurs in one 24-hour period, and there's one plot. Midsummer Night's Dream, very brief overview. We start with Theseus and Hippolyta. Theseus, Duke of Athens, great hero, killed the Minotaur, all that kind of stuff. He's getting ready to marry Hippolyta, queen of the Amazons. What are the Amazons? Who are the Amazons?
They're a group of all women.
Women warrior tribe. Okay? Men are their slaves, both physical, they do the housework and all that kind of stuff, and sexual. Why? Because you have to have men in order to keep the race going on. So when a new boy is born, that boy will become a slave eventually, or a servant. Let's be nice. How serious are they about their warriorship? Can't think of the right word. How do you know? What did they do? How serious were they? They would cut off their left breast. Why? So that when they took a stance with a bow and arrow and released that arrow string isn't going to catch their breast. I mean, you got to be pretty devoted to do that. So, those two are getting married. The very next thing, we get introduced to a man named Aegeus, who comes in with his daughter. He wants his daughter to marry a man named Demetrius. She doesn't love Demetrius. She loves a man named Lysander. There's the main conflict. She wants to marry one guy, her father wants her to marry another guy. Every comedy begins with a rupture in society. That's the main rupture. Okay? We're going to be introduced then to the fairy world, where you have Oberon, king of the fairies, to Tanya, his queen. They're at it hammer and tongs. Why? She has a little boy, not his, that he wants to be one of his henchmen, to grow up to be one of, or hench fairies, to be one of his hench fairies. The little boy is hers because she took the boy from a woman who was a follower of hers, an Indian woman, who died. So she's raising the boy to serve her in her retinue. So their conflict. There's going to be an implied bit of conflict between Theseus and Hippolyta. All right? So notice what we have right off the bat. One single plot? No. We have 3 plots. They all revolve around romance, marriage, etc. Okay? There's also the rude mechanicals. These men who work with their hands. Joiners, tinkers, tailors. Okay? Joiners, woodworkers. Bellows menders. And they're going to put on a play within the play. So it's like 4th plot. But all the plots ultimately get around to problems of the heart, right? So unity of action out the window. Unity of place. 2 settings within the play. The city of Athens, or the court of Duke Theseus, and a wood or forest outside Athens. Unity of place, out the window. Time. Now, fair Hippolyta, our nuptial hour draws on apace. 4 happy days bring in another moon. Going to be at least 4 days. 24-hour time. Why? Shakespeare didn't know Aristotle. Shakespeare hadn't read on poetics. He didn't know that Aristotle said you should only do and more than likely, if he did, Shakespeare probably would have said, no, not going to do that. Okay? Later writers, 18th century writers, criticized Shakespeare and other writers like him for not following the unities because they're going back to the classical period. So, Theseus introduces the play and says, 4 days, Hippolyta, we're getting married. But oh, methinks how slow this old moon wanes. What's his point? He can't wait. Man, I wish the new moon would come. He wants to get married quickly. She lingers my desire. Yeah, he's probably talking about sex. Okay? Hippolyta, 4 days will quickly steep themselves in night. Steep, like when you steep tea, what does it do? It darkens the water. She is saying those 4 days they're going to be buried, overcome by darkness, by the night. And then she says, 4 nights will quickly dream away the time. First instance of the word dream, by the way. Title, A Midsummer Night's Dream. What does she mean? Have you ever had the experience where you're either looking forward to something greatly or dreading something greatly? What's it like building up to that? Tension, apprehension, anxiety, desire possibly. And then the thing happens, the event happens, and you look back on the time leading up to it, and it's like what? It's like a dream. And it's gone. What is she saying? Let's slow down the time. And then the moon, like to a silver bow now bent in heaven, shall behold the night of our solemnities. It's almost like he's saying, come on. And she's going, whoa. Why? Amazon! She doesn't want to be, quote unquote, ruled by a man. Okay? So, Theseus tells his servant, Philostrates, stir up the Athenian rebels. Get the Athenian youth to do what? To put on a show for our wedding night. Jugglers, bear dance, all that kind of stuff. Aegeus comes in. Theseus welcomes him. What's up? And Aegeus tells us he is full of vexation, come I, with complaint against my child. And we have the first real inkling of a conflict. That's where we'll pick up on Monday. Monday we will do all of Act 1. Don't forget, there's a quiz due tonight over Antigone.